Here, I'll just kind of give some questions. The first question is, historically, what role has the Marxist left played in the development of Israel? What would a critical Marxist perspective on Israel, the ideology of Zionism, and the Palestinian conflict look like? Has a left critique historically been applied? The second question, what is the relationship between the American political hegemony and Israel? How has this traditionally been understood by the left, and how is it now being portrayed? Has this understanding obscured attempts at a political and theoretical analysis? How has it affected the international left's approach to the actual political opposition among Palestinians? And then finally, why have leftist approaches to the conflict emphasized resistance over cogent political vision? Do measures such as the BDS campaign and the Flotilla effort that seeks to delegitimize Israel and the ideology of Zionism through resistance to immediate means and policies ameliorate immediate social conditions or clarify political conditions? If not, what sort of approach should be emphasized? So I guess, Alan, if you'd like to begin here.
Sure. Just to clarify and introduce myself, I'm Helen Goodman. I'm a correspondent for Revolution newspaper, which is the voice of the Revolutionary Communist Party USA, and yeah, they brought some for everyone. So, I will be speaking to the three questions, but as everyone does when they engage with questions, I'll be reshaping them a bit in terms of, because in some ways I think, what are the questions is part of the discourse here. This special issue of Revolution newspaper is an in-depth exploration of the nature and role of Israel in the world today, and it poses the question, bastion of enlightenment or enforcer for imperialism? Now, as many people remark, well, when you pose a question, it's a leading question, but interestingly, I found that people who have profound disagreements with us actually agree that these are the terms of things, and I think as we dig into things this evening and wrestle with the actual genesis, not the mystical biblical one, but the real world genesis of the state of Israel, how it was founded, that the question of whether or not we, should or do, or what the role of legitimizing or delegitimizing Israel comes down to is, in fact, that objectively, this is a state that, as I will make an argument, is not a legitimate state. Well, let me start by just sharing an experience I had taking this issue of Revolution out at Columbia University, and it's provoked all kinds of responses, but I'm going to pick out one because I think it helps highlight the stakes of what it is we're engaging with tonight. Someone who was selling this paper, a young guy who was a much more talented agitator than myself, was saying, "Pop quiz. If you can tell me which state in the Middle East has nuclear weapons, I'll give you a free copy of this paper." Well, my immediate reaction was alarm. How are we going to pay for all the papers we're going to give away? And we did get someone to sponsor. A faculty member did buy a few copies to sponsor the contest. But first of all, do people in this room know what state in the Middle East has nuclear weapons? Interesting. Israel has what? Jordan. Yeah, right. Israel has, a substantial and apparently quite effective nuclear weapons arsenal, because it's one thing to develop the capacity to launch, to put together one or a few nuclear weapons on the level of North Korea or something. It's another thing to have sophisticated delivery systems and intelligence and everything else needed to make those nuclear weapons effective. And Israel does have it's the world's worst kept secret in a sense. They have kind of a refuse to confirm or deny policy in terms of their nuclear arsenal, but as Mordecai Vanunu, an Israeli scientist, is exposed, and actually in Jimmy Carter's book, I believe, he lists 120 as the number of nuclear weapons Israel has. But here's the bad part, or the challenge. each person who came up to us and said, well, Iran, I think, we explained actually, Iran's nuclear program is, perhaps on the verge of developing, weapons-grade nuclear material. Israel has a sophisticated nuclear weapons arsenal. And then the response was, a lot of people felt a lot more comfortable knowing Israel has 120 nuclear weapons than they were knowing that Iran might get 1 or 2. So I think that identifies, I noted in today's Times, I don't know if people saw it, there's an update on the so-called peace process, as I would describe it, and I think why I say that will become clear in a few minutes. But buried in that article, the U.S. is transferring to Israel either its most sophisticated fighter jets or, very sophisticated fighter jets as part of sweetening the pot to induce Israel to engage in quote-unquote peace talks with the Palestinian Authorities. So, there is a real danger of a major war breaking out in this region in the form of an Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear arsenal, and that is just one way of coming at the sort of meta states or geopolitical states of understanding the nature of Israel, even beyond the apartheid-like conditions that the Palestinian people are subjected to. So I think by just kind of letting you in on what's on this issue, I can sort of outline, what it is that we're making a case for. First of all, our main article has a very substantial and developed argument that there wouldn't be a viable Zionist movement as we know it, and certainly not a state of Israel, were it not for the sponsorship of colonial and imperialist powers. Perhaps the biggest misconception that I find when I engage with people around the history and nature of Israel is that the general narrative that's generally accepted is that in the wake of the Holocaust, the international community, the German ruling class who carried out the Holocaust, the systematic mass murder of millions, close to 6 million Jews, and the Allies who turned their back on Jews trying to flee Nazi Germany, another little-known fact that we, that all of a sudden, oh my God, what did, we did such a bad thing to the Jews in World War II, they should have a country of their own where this can never happen again. Well, there is a coincidental convergence between the end of World War II, the, coming to light of some of the crimes of the Holocaust and the state of Israel. But that's not an accurate way to understand the cause and effect. The fundamental driving force behind the establishment of Israel was the experience of Great Britain, who, when approached by the founders of Zionism, and had a quote that I just find, maybe it'll take more explanation, but Sir Ronald Storrs, the first British military governor of Jerusalem, wrote that England's support for the Zionist enterprise was one that blessed him that gave, meaning England, as well as him that took, by forming for England a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. And without going into the whole analogy, Ulster being Northern Ireland, which was the way that Britain used to dominate Ireland for centuries, or quite a while. This does concentrate how the world powers that be have looked at Israel. They have not been driven by a desire for justice for survivors of the Holocaust. And in fact, if you want to get a sense of how banned it is to ask the obvious question, if one was looking for reparations, justice, and compensation for the victims of the Holocaust, wouldn't justice be for that to happen where they lived and where those crimes took place? And as some of you may remember, when Helen Thomas, who was the dean of the White House press corps for decades, had the temerity to pose this question in public, she was ridden out of mainstream journalism about 6 months ago, maybe more recently. So That's the essential case that's made. I also want to show you this map, which, but it points to places around the world, and I think this is very revealing about the nature and role of Israel. Places around the world where Israel has carried out, on behalf of U.S. imperialism, terrible crimes. I mean, very little was known about these things, but in the 1980s, Israel was the key force behind or a key force, certainly a vital force, behind the genocidal killing of up to 200,000 Guatemalan peasants during a time that the U.S. was engaged in contention with the Soviet Union over Soviet-backed resistance movements in Central America. Perhaps better known but still generally kept secret, is Israel's tight relationship with apartheid South Africa. This was something that had a very formative effect on me personally in the 1960s. I remember having an argument with my Saturday school teacher where he was telling us, look, if Israel didn't support South Africa and the apartheid regime, which, by the way, I learned later, the people running that regime had sided with the Nazis in World War II and weren't just, Nazis in the generic term, but were, white supremacists, pro-Nazis, the Boers who ruled apartheid South Africa. And our Saturday school teacher told me, well, if Israel didn't support South Africa, there's a danger that South Africa would reclassify Jewish people in South Africa as colored. There were kind of three classes of people in South Africa: white, black people who lived in really horrific conditions and overt segregation, and then colored in the middle, and the Jews were classified white. And I remember blurting out, and when he said this, why would we want to be white? Which I think does, I was on to something that I didn't fully understand at the time. But again, I won't go through it, but it's a carefully documented argument in our issue that you can't, in the special issue of Revolution, that you can't understand the nature of Israel without understanding the nature of its global imperialist sponsors, first Britain and then later the U.S. And even the actions that Israel has taken in the Middle East, for example, in relation to wars with Egypt or Syria, were mainly driven by the needs of U.S. imperialism. For example, in the 70s and 80s, contending with the Soviet Union in the Cold War and Arab states in the region that aligned themselves with Israel. And then there is, very specifically speaking to the nature of the Holocaust. There's a quote by Balabakian, the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party. After the Holocaust, the worst thing that has happened to Jewish people is the state of Israel. And there's, this sometimes has provoked smiles, sometimes threats. But in any case, it's obviously very provocative, but it's also very substantial. And I won't, ruin the experience of thinking your way through it. But one of the things that's clearly, underlying this is that the state of Israel was something that was done to Jewish people, which again goes very much against the dominant narrative. I guess the last substantial point I want to make is on the question of legitimacy. This, we open our special issue by posing this challenge. Welcome those of you who just got here. I'm one of the speakers, Helen Goodman. I correspond for Revolution newspaper, the voice of the Revolutionary Communist Party. In the introduction to our issue, we pose, the state of Israel is projected to the world as an outpost of democracy and tolerance in a sea of intolerant Islam bent on its destruction. To be considered a credible mainstream voice in U.S. politics, academia, or the media, one must present Israel as a front line of defense against jihad and a critical fortress defending our way of life. And the example I gave about Helen Thomas's career being ruined simply because she had the timidity to ask why wouldn't justice for the victims of the Holocaust mean reparations for Jewish people in Europe when the Palestinians weren't responsible for the Holocaust. But then, here's a methodological point that I anticipate is going to be controversial because it goes very much up against postmodernism and relativism. what is the essential nature of Israel, and how does one understand what seems to be a paradox of a country founded to make up for a great crime, itself committing great crimes, both against the Palestinians and things like South Africa and Guatemala that I noted around the world. And here's the methodological point. Answering these questions is not about competing narratives. The question here is what is true and what is just. To get into this, we will examine the history of Israel to understand the actual dynamics that led to today's situation. So there's two last points I want to make. One, responding specifically to this question of the history of the left in relation to Israel. It hasn't been one of our better moments. Our leader, Bob Avakian, has done a lot of work to excavate the experience of Russia and China when they were socialist countries during the brief 60-year period that one or both of them were socialists. And during that time, those countries mainly supported national liberation struggles around the world. But it is an unfortunate fact that the Soviet Union helped sponsor the State of Israel. It's just documented. They did it in the UN, and they actually helped supply arms to Israel. And as part of what we refer to as Bob Avakian's new synthesis, he's put a lot of emphasis on the need for the next stage of the world communist revolution to take a radically different approach to the relationship between the interests of existing socialist countries and the world revolution, and essentially to reverse the way that dialectic has been looked at up to now. And this is, you'll find this throughout, and I recommend people who are interested check this out, the Constitution, which just came out for the new Socialist Republic in North America, a draft proposal from the RCP. You'll find throughout this in economics, in every realm, putting the world revolution first. So that's, it's a bit of a tangent, but it seemed appropriate to note that given the nature of the questions we were posed. Finally, on this legitimacy question, is there an objective criteria for whether or not a country is legitimate? Well, let me pose this. I don't accept that the norms and international laws and so on of the dominant powers in the world today are the ultimate expression of international justice, the World Court in The Hague, whatever. But even by their own standards, if you take what Serbian leaders were convicted of doing to the Bosnians and apply those same standards and criteria to the Zionists in Israel, there's no question, and Iwan Pape, the courageous Israeli historian, has made this case on a whole book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. When Jewish immigration to Israel started, Jews were 5% of the population of Palestine. Today they're a majority within the borders of the State of Israel. That wasn't just a demographic shift. The same kinds of things, and Iwan Pape, again, in a very courageous work, documents incident after incident where things that can't be described any other way than terrorist attacks were carried out against Palestinian villages. Now, the narrative I was always taught as growing up a liberal Jew is, well, we purchased land. Mostly it was just a land without a people for a people without a land. And then there were those Irgun crackpots who did some kind of bad things. No. You don't have to burn down every village in Palestine, publicly rape women, and carry out all kinds of acts that really I couldn't read out loud, but I suggest you look up in Pape's book, documented from first-hand sources, first-hand Israeli sources. You don't have to do that to every village in a country to ethnically cleanse it, to send a message that people better flee. And this took a horrific expression in the Nakba in 1948 when an orgy of such terrorist ethnic cleansing took place. And, if necessary, we can debate the circumstances behind that. So, to summarize, I'm arguing 2 points. One, by objective standards of legitimacy, it's not a matter of should we be arguing. Objectively, Israel was built on ethnic cleansing. The inhabitants of Palestine have been driven out of their country, and they have a right to have their country back. And secondly, that the essential nature of Israel is that of a creature of and an enforcer for imperialism. And the stakes of this are tremendously high in the world today. You know, many people are very upset and outraged by Israel's crimes. I'll just conclude with one story. I participated in the Gaza Freedom March last New Year's, where we were detained in Egypt, but were attempting to break the blockade of Gaza by land. And after being detained in Egypt for a couple of weeks, I was flying back. And the big story in the Middle East was that a U.S. Predator drone had killed 43 civilians in Yemen. Or I may have the details wrong. I'm going off. You know, I didn't look it up before I came here, although I picked up newspapers in the Middle East that documented this. And then the next day, there was a protest demonstration in that Yemeni village, and one of the protesters was shot and killed. This was the major news in the Middle East. Then I get back to the U.S., and of course, the big news is the Times Square incident, where regardless of whatever the intentions or capacity of the person who was, you know, arrested, no one was actually hurt. And this was just, you know, mass hysteria. I mean, it just, oh my God, you know, the Muslim terrorists are everywhere. And I just think, you know, we have to appreciate that around the world there's a whole different perception that much more. Who were those 43 people killed in a Yemeni village, and why did they die, you know? And I'll just note that among the other things in this special issue is an excerpt of an article by Bob Avakian analyzing the clash between Western imperialism and Islamic fundamentalism, and pointing out that, first of all, between the two, the U.S. has committed by far the greater crimes. And second of all, we here in America have to break the vicious cycle of McWorld versus jihad by taking a clear stand against our own government and starting to think not like Americans, but in the interest of humanity. So I think that's a concentrated presentation of my basic points.
Thank you.
I would actually like to later go on to address the questions that were raised specifically, try to answer each one in detail. But I was asked to prepare some remarks, so I will just read these remarks and then go on and we can open it up for questions. So, my esteemed teacher and friend, the late Iqbal Ahmad, who was also himself a close friend of the late Edward Said, and Edward Said actually dedicated his book Culture and Imperialism to him, once remarked many years ago when speaking on the difficulty of addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He was a lovely, genuinely beautiful man, by the way. When speaking on the difficulty of addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that the first thing one must bear in mind is that one is dealing with two communities of suffering. Furthermore, each is a symbolic representative victim of two great crimes. The Jews, although by no means the only victims of fascism, are the archetypal victims of fascism. The Palestinians, although by no means the only victims of colonialism, nor even the worst victims, have also, like the Jews with their particular fate, become perhaps the archetypal representative of a colonized people for many around the world. The intersection of these two communities of suffering leads to many pitfalls of discourse, of which I am painfully aware. I will not be addressing such issues here, however, and you must take my sympathy for all victims of oppression for granted. Rather, I will address, as much as is honestly possible, the question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Marxism. This is by no means a self-evident perspective, and one that is generally avoided even by professed Marxists who, when they speak on the issue, usually say things that are identical to what many non- and anti-Marxists said. So is there then a Marxist perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? To begin to address this question, I will draw your attention to two articles that both purport to offer such a perspective, although they come to radically different conclusions. One is an article entitled Bastion of Enlightenment or Enforcer for Imperialism, The Case of Israel, that appeared recently in Revolution, the newspaper of the Revolutionary Communist Party, which we're just hearing about. And the other, an article entitled Israel and Communism, that appeared in Platypus Review, issue number 28. The latter, which is a translation from a German article that appeared a few years ago, I think 2003, will strike most American readers as by far the more exotic and strange of the two. Indeed, to many, it has seemed not a document pertaining to the left at all, but rather a manifestation of neoconservatism, which by a process of association, Platypus has also been tagged with by some. I point out this article appeared next to an interview with Noam Chomsky, and that the appearance of articles in Platypus Review by no means is a support of Platypus for the positions in the article. Platypus Review tries to publish articles from many different positions. Yet the deep origins of the anti-Deutsch current, from which that article is written, it's a very pro-Israeli article, are within German Maoism, particularly the Kommunistische Bund, and the article is premised on an acceptance of Marxist categories and written in a Marxist language. I would actually say a Marxist jargon. While superficially the Platypus article and the Revolution article appear to be polar opposites, I would like to claim that they actually stem from a similar methodology and misconception of the left. To make this point more clearly, let me refer you to the following passage in the article in Revolution. The article says, in the aftermath of World War II, the U.S. emerged at the top of the imperialist world order in a position to dictate terms to both defeated rivals like Germany and Japan and allies like Britain and France. Around the world, the U.S. moved to supplant old colonial powers and swallow up or encompass their spheres of influence. But other important forces also emerged out of World War II. For a short time, the Soviet Union and China formed the socialist camp that confronted the imperialist world. And another major factor in the post-war political stage was a powerful wave of national liberation struggles throughout especially Asia and Africa and against the weakened colonial powers of Europe and Japan. Yet in 1948, as we just heard, the Soviet Union under Stalin's dictatorship supported the creation of Israel, and the socialist camp, above mentioned, provided via Czechoslovakia significant, some would argue decisive material aid to Israel. Furthermore, many articles appeared in the communist press at the time hailing the Israeli struggle as an anti-imperialist one. Arab communist parties, which were small but did exist in several countries, particularly Egypt and Iraq, loyally opposed the intervention of the Arab armies and supported the partition resolution. And the Israeli Communist Party took an extremely patriotic line during the war, at one point even criticizing Ben-Gurion in Kol Ha'am, their newspaper, Voice of the People in Hebrew, for being an agent of British imperialism for not conquering even more Arab territory than he did. So in 1948, progressive and communist, that is, I would call it from Mike Trotskyist background, Stalinist opinion was much closer to the position of the anti-Deutsch article than to that of the RCP article. It's also worth mentioning in 1948 in the United States, there was a third-party candidate running on a party called the Progressive Party, Henry Wallace, and of the three parties running, he, the left-wing independent candidate, the Ralph Nader of 1948, was the most pro-Israeli, more so than Truman or Bush. Well, nowadays anti-Zionist Jews are assumed to be on the left, although in fact the largest group of anti-Zionist Jews are actually found among the ultra-Orthodox. This was not the case in mid-century. Indeed, for many years, the leading organization of anti-Zionist Jews in the U.S., the American Council for Judaism, was an organization of Eisenhower Republicans, and its main founder, Rabbi Elmer Berger, once warned that U.S. support for Israel would drive the Arabs into the hands of the communists, a prediction that clearly did not pan out. What has remained structurally constant, however, despite this great shift in loyalties among progressive public opinion, is the insistence on seeing the question in terms of which nationalist cause to support. That is, the essentially internationalist character of revolutionary Marxism has been supported to the logic of national liberation, even by those who claim to be revolutionary Marxists. This is true just as much of those who claim to be in an anti-Stalinist or Trotskyist tradition as those with Stalinist and Maoist genealogies. I would argue that if there is any political lesson to be learned from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it is that national liberation for oppressed peoples can be a delusion. After all, the deeply tragic character of Zionism stems from its Janus-like character. To the Palestinians, it was and is a colonial settler movement. But to the Jews, it presented itself as a movement of national liberation for an oppressed people. It is customary to focus on one side of this, the colonial settler side, to delegitimize Zionism, and the other, the national liberation movement, to legitimize it. But I wish to emphasize that both are integral to it. Conversely, it will be argued that I am neglecting the distinction between the nationalism of the oppressed and the oppressor. To this response, one must simply pose the question of whether the nationalism of the oppressed can actually liberate the oppressed people. There is the sentimental notion that oppressed peoples, through their resistance to oppression, liberate themselves. Posed in this way, one has little need to think about the politics of resistance, only to support resistance. In fact, however, resistance, even heroic resistance, does not end oppression unless the material and social forces to overcome it are present. It is questionable, for example, whether in the whole history of humanity there has been more than one successful slave revolt. It was neither John Brown nor Denmark Vesey who ended chattel slavery in the U.S., but the Union armies of the northern bourgeoisie. It was not the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising or the heroic struggles of Jewish partisans that ended the Holocaust, but the material superiority of the Allied armed forces, particularly the Red Army. Israel is a successful advanced capitalist state with hundreds of nuclear weapons. The figure of 120 was quoted. Most of the figures I've read are over 200, and some are considerably higher than that, 200 to 400. And an immense economic and military superiority to the Palestinians. Only a politics that bridges the national divide and breaks the loyalty of masses of Israeli Jews to their state, can in fact bring liberation to the Palestinians. To pose the need for such a politics will in the present moment seem utopian. It is counterposed to all the political forces on the ground in Israel-Palestine, the State of Israel, of course, but also the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Nor, truthfully, does it resonate with any but a handful of Israelis or Palestinians. At present, all politics around the issue is formulated in terms of the acceptance of the bourgeois nation-state. This is true not only of the explicitly right-wing politics in both the Jewish and Arab versions, but also of both of the so-called two-state and one-state solutions. I hope to have an opportunity to expatiate on this theme in the question and answer period. For in a deep sense, 1948 is the last and most ambiguous legacy of 1848.
Okay, thank you guys very much. So let me see if anyone has any questions for our panelists in particular.
If you don't have any questions, I would begin to respond to some of those questions.
What are like each other? Perhaps you would
Right, that was the one. Yeah, if you want.
Well, you didn't respond to mine, but I was going to respond to some of the questions specifically about imperialism. Because can I make a comment about
Sure,
imperialism?
go ahead, Richard.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I thank the Revolutionary Communist Party for participating in this discussion, and sometimes Platypus is boycotted, and I'm sorry that the DSA did not participate because they were also invited. I'm glad also that the Revolutionary Communist Party emphasizes the role of imperialism. I would have a somewhat different understanding of it, but actually one of the most disturbing things in the present understanding on the half of many leftists is the extent to which many leftists buy a sort of Mearsheimer Israel lobby that support for Israel is not in the interests, quote, national interests of the U.S. I have a lot of problems with it. I would argue again that the relationship between imperialism and Zionism is a complicated one. For example, in the case of British imperialism and Zionism, Herzl originally imagined that he could sort of buy Palestine from the Ottoman Empire. That was naive of him. He didn't really understand Ottoman politics or the situation at the time. The support for British imperialism and an alliance with imperialism was, of course, crucial to the success of the Zionist enterprise. However, the relationship between Zionism and British imperialism was somewhat fraught. And there was a kind of mutual betrayal on both sides. When the British spoke about a little loyal Jewish Ulster, they did not really foresee an independent Jewish state. So ultimately, Zionism did in fact come in conflict with British imperialism. So there were in fact two rebellions against British imperialism. There was the Arab Revolt, which you could really call the first Intifada, from 1936 to 1939, in which the Zionists sided with the British in helping to suppress that. And while that is, I think, a legitimate anti-imperialist revolt, one also has to realize that it had a very right-wing leadership and a problematic leadership. And then there was also the Zionist Revolt, which after the Palestinian leadership had been largely crushed by the defeat of that revolt, there was essentially a Zionist revolt against the British right in the aftermath, which led the British to turn Palestine over to the UN, the partition resolution, the civil war in Palestine between Jews and Arabs, etc., and then the intervention of the Arab armies. I think that the proper way of understanding the relationship with Zionism and imperialism is that Zionism structurally needed an external alliance. The alliance with Britain was always a fraught and problematic one. After independence, probably the main patron of Israel and Israel's closest ally was probably France. If you look at the Israeli attitude, for example, during the Suez Crisis, there was still a lot of hostility between the Israelis and the British. It's worth bearing in mind, we spoke about Soviet-aid Israel, it's worth bearing in mind that the commander of the Jordanian army, who was later fired, but the commander of the Jordanian army, a major Arab army at the time, was in fact the British army officer. So there was a direct connection there. And this was part of the way progressives justified to themselves the notion that the Israelis were fighting against British imperialism. And I think that all of that shows how one needs to problematize these narratives of anti-imperialism and national self-determination. And France was the main external ally of Britain for a period in the 50s and 60s, and then that was supplanted by the U.S. The U.S., as a patron of Israel, has been clearly, from the Israeli standpoint, the most beneficial, the one with which there's the least conflict. It's an alliance that, particularly after 1967 and 1973, has greatly deepened. One significant turning point in the alliance was clearly in 1970, Black September, when Israeli support for the Jordanian monarchy saved the Jordanian monarchy. In other words, what I want to emphasize here is not the specifics of the narrative, but the fact that in a structural perspective, I think that U.S. support for Israel is overall rational. Now, having said that, that does not follow that, for example, the craziness that goes on in Hebron every day is simply a manifestation of imperialism. Not everything in the world that goes on is directly a manifestation of imperialism. Not, for example, the wars in 1967. I don't think that the U.S. pushed Israel into that war. I don't think that, just as I don't think the Soviet Union pushed the Arabs into that war. That was a war that happened because of specific local circumstances. It turned out to be a great success for Israel. I'm not sure that it was actually...
Richard, let me just see if Alan has... If you want to just
anyway,
wrap up and then everyone's saying particular...
Yeah, well, I definitely want to respond to what Richard said because I don't agree with it. Let me make an analogy here, and I'm stealing something that Bob Avakian has said, but we're living in the house of Tony Soprano. We live in a country where we can get together in a college campus, friendly security guards as long as you're the right color and have the right ID and all, right income and all that. We can discuss all kinds of things. We can go out of here and maybe we're having trouble figuring out how to pay our rent, but, go to other parts of the world and compare. And our standard of living is built on a system that ravages the world. Those cars outside, the cabs, the livery, they're fueled because, regimes like the Saudis cut off the heads or hands of people who protest. There's a tremendous amount of resentment around the world, and it's not because they hate us for our freedoms, it's because every time Uncle Sam shows up, you have Abu Ghraib, you have mass graves, you have torture chambers. And Israel plays a foundational role in propping up that world system. And in particular on behalf of the United States. And yes, there are challenging questions, in terms of understanding the nature of that conflict between Palestinians. There are different class forces among Palestinians. You know, I read Benny Morris's book, 1948. I don't know if anybody's read this. But, you know, first they'll describe some Zionist atrocity, and then they'll say, oh, but then a crowd of angry Arabs, you know, clubbed a Jew to death. And then, you know, as I was reading it, I was thinking, you know, this is if you describe the genocidal theft of the land of the Native Americans, and you balanced every story of Wounded Knee and every U.S. Army atrocity was, yeah, but then those savages attacked a farmhouse, burned it down, and killed a little child inside. You can't understand the world that way. That's relativism, and it leads to bad things morally. Well, gee, you know, I don't know, the Israelis have done, you know, some bad things, but then what about those really angry Arabs over there? Well, there's both a methodological and a moral problem with that. You know, do you want to look at what your country is responsible for, you know, and postmodernist and relativist and, well, you know, it's all so complicated, gee, I don't know what's right and what's wrong, is part of it, but part of it is you have to step outside your comfort zone as an American to confront what your government, you know, I mentioned in my opening remarks, as some of you were trickling in, today's Times, the U.S. just transferred, as part of sweetening the pot for so-called peace negotiations, agreed to transfer its most advanced jet fighters to Israel. What do you think those jet fighters are going to do? Protect Israeli farmers from a Hamas rocket launched from Gaza? No. You don't use that level of jet fighter for that. That level of jet fighter is used to attack countries far away that threaten U.S. interests. You know, and there's a more, I mean, I do want to just make one technical note. When Richard was quoting from the article in Revolution, he neglected to note that he ended his quote before he used the term Stalinist dictatorship. That's not in Revolution.
No, that's quite true.
We don't use the word Stalinist.
No, I agree. That was my
all right, I'm sure it was inadvertent.
No.
I didn't think you were, I just wanted to distinguish that.
Term. That's not...
Up until then, he was quoting from the article, and I'll quote it he was quoting from. But there's a moral question here. Let me just pose it one final way. You know, you're living in Tony Soprano's house, and, you know, there's some screaming out in the backyard, and Tony's out there beating somebody. Well, do you say to yourself, gee, I don't know, maybe the guy Tony's beating, you know, was kind of a thug himself, or do you say, oh my God, this house and everything I'm living in is built on, you know, living in the home of a gangster who's killing and torturing people, so, and then bringing home a nice plasma TV for me. So my point isn't don't go home and throw out your plasma TV or stop driving, but we do have to confront the nature of the world we live in, our place in it, and what responsibility that poses on us. And yes, we have to not yes, and then I'm agreeing with Richard, but there is a dimension to, look, you know, there's a profound criticism of the experience of the World Socialist Revolution in our newspaper. But it's also a fact that revolutions happen by country by country. There are oppressed countries. You know, black people's anger at being oppressed in the United States is not the same as the Tea Party's resentment of black people for whatever it is they've been deluded into thinking black people have done to them. So these are basic questions of both epistemology and morality.
Well, let me just see if anyone has, does anyone have any specific questions now?
I have a specific question.
Sure.
So, what does Marxism talk about morality? I mean, Richard here, you give this kind of very bizarre history of the founding of Israel that's littered with mistakes and omissions. Richard gives a fair reply to it. I think there's a lot of things that he didn't reply that holds a dear thing, and you respond by giving basically a motive argument about how we're supposed to be anti-Zionist. I don't see how this is like Marxist in any way. I don't even see how this follows like Bababakian thought or anything. You really kind of lost me here. Like, why didn't you answer the specific points that he made about how the narrative you give about the founding of Israel is filled with holes?
Well, let me see if there's anything else, Richard, really quick before, so we can get a couple questions, then I'll, yes.
Oh, I just wanted, Richard could expand on what you were saying earlier about opposing the idea of the bourgeois nation state as a solution, or the one state or two state solution that you were saying earlier. Could you expand on that?
Is there anyone else? Really quick. Yeah, let's go backwards. Well,
I just want to respond briefly to the question. I think that the morality is a complicated thing. I mean, I think there is a moral dimension to Marxism. And I'm anti-Zionist. I've never been a Zionist. I would agree about anti-Zionism. And I also am very much aware that the Palestinians are oppressed. I've been to Palestine. I've seen things. Hebron is a hellish place. I mentioned that. When I'm talking about it, though, and I'm also very much aware of the history of Jewish oppression. I mean, I know people personally who have undergone extreme suffering, both Palestinians and Jews. I'm trying to understand that. And I think that when one tries to understand that, sometimes it seems as well one is removing oneself from a moral position. I'm trying to talk about imperialism or opposition to it not as a moral category, but as a political and analytic category. So, for example, you have this question about Israel being an apartheid state. Now, the terms in which that's used are, I think, moralistic. So the question is not, is the Israeli oppression of the Palestinians as bad as apartheid? To me, that's not the question. I mean, you could say that. I say, well, it is, in many respects. In some respects, it's worse. What I object to with that terminology is that it's very bad sociology, that the political and economic logic of apartheid and that of Zionism are radically different, and that therefore talking about it loosely in terms of the struggle is confusing. Okay, on the question of the bourgeois nation state and the one state versus two states. The two-state solution is, if posed honestly, a negotiated surrender of the Palestinians to Zion. That's what it is. And everybody knows that. So it's that the Palestinians say, okay, you get 78% of Palestine and we get 22%, or that's the opening bid, and then there's some maneuvering and there's some kind of agreement. The biggest obstacle to a two-state solution has nothing to do with the Palestinians. It has to do with U.S. and Israeli policy. Now, why U.S. and Israeli policy are so opposed to something that could actually be good for them is a complicated question. I want to put that aside. And in terms of the one-state solution politics, first of all, a lot of one-state politics is just fraudulent. It's like people talking about a one-state solution who don't even really believe in it. But to the extent that you take it seriously, if you read what most of these people who are advocating a one-state solution believe in, they are talking in terms of still the bourgeois nation state. If you read people like Virginia Tilley or Ali Abu Nima, I mean, they're anti-Marxist. I'm not saying that as like some pejorative thing. I'm just saying that's a neutral description. It's like Edward Said was anti-Marxist. He was a great man in many ways, but that's the proper analytical description of their political position. It's a liberal position. I don't believe, okay, for many reasons, there doesn't even exist a politics anywhere on the ground advocating a serious liberal one-statism. But I don't think that the liberal one-state program has any chance of succeeding. I think that the only context in which a one-state program might succeed would be in the context of a radical transformation of social relations. In other words, if it were framed within a Marxist context. But again, the question of one state versus two state is really not the issue, because if you had, say, a binational political movement committed to Arab-Jewish socialist coexistence and the abolition of existing social relations, you know, whether you end up with a federation or two socialist states or one binational state or whatever, that's a really secondary consideration. But you'd have to have a transformation in the way the politics is conceived. And the dominant way the politics is conceived is either in a really right-wing context or the two-state solution. And, you know, Salam Fayyad was on television. I heard him the other day, and he's, you know, this classic pro-Western bourgeois technocrat. He's up there saying, well, Palestinian economy will have a lot of chance to grow because, you know, we're next to this huge economy that's 25 times our size. So that as a program, that's a very conservative program. Now, the obstacles to that program have to do with the extremely right-wing politics in the United States and Israel. And that's a separate issue. But it's not an anti-imperialist program.
First of all, what does morality have to do with Marxism? I think morality has always been part of Marxism, but it is a hallmark of what Bob Avakian and the RCP are bringing forward to put more emphasis on morality. Here's an example. If we are going to say torture's wrong for the people who rule this country, does that standard apply to a revolutionary society? Well, frankly, the experience of the Marxist movement up to now has been a bit expedient on questions like that. And a lot of what Avakian's argued is that when, there has to be a struggle to objectively define a morality that corresponds to the interests of humanity, and then to hold ourselves accountable to it even when it gets in the way of our narrow objectives. So that's appears to. So that's a very short answer to the morality thing, but I do, it's something that Bob Avakian has written on very extensively. Secondly, I just want to identify in Marxist terms, there has always been what Leninists and Maoists and those, people who look to the RCP for leadership today have identified as a social chauvinist or economist trend in Marxism, which is that, well, after all, it's all about getting, raising people's standard of living and, and building up a powerful country. And gee, a shortcut to that would be to have the Palestinians just kind of merge with Israel. Well, Stalin had quite a bit of that, if you want to talk about Stalin's problems. He did see, building up a powerful, centralized economy is the key to getting to communism. And a lot of Mao's criticism of Stalin, and, one of the things that I've always found ironic is that I see a tremendous, to me, the Trotsky went even further than Stalin on that problem, qualitatively so. But, a lot of Mao's rupture was, wait, that's a mechanical approach to getting, you're not going to get to communism that way. People have to change. Inequalities like the oppression of women aren't so easily eradicated. And the Soviet Union was like, well, we got 50% women doctors, problem solved. No, because then when the women went home, they still had to cook, clean, look pretty, and, be good in bed, and all kinds of things like that. So part of the tradition of Marxism that we're associated with, breaks with economism, and that has profound, that's why you don't read about, workers' strikes repeatedly every week in Revolution newspaper. The third thing I want to raise, and it's your call, but it does seem that, there aren't a lot of hands up, and in the spirit of really trying to get to the truth of things, I would very much like to hear what it is that you feel was a distortion. And obviously, I had to present a very compressed and selected, not selective, picture of the foundation of Israel, but seems that, if you want, it seems like if you're in a position to refute it, you should.
I feel like Richard gave a number of polls in your account. You don't refer to how the British actually responded to immigration to Palestine, where they forbid land sales to immigrant Zionist Jews and then forbid immigration altogether with the White Papers. During World War II, they did not allow European Jews to enter Palestine. This continued until after the war. And of course, one of the things that drove the final establishment of Israel were pogroms in Soviet-controlled occupied Poland that happened after World War II. You did mention that the Soviets backed the foundation of Israel. I disagree with your comments on Helen Thomas. What she said is that Jews in Israel should go back to, I believe the specifics were Poland and Germany, which were, okay, so 75% of Jews who live in Israel were born in Israel today. You're saying that she's been attacked for claiming that reparations should be paid by the home countries, but she was attacked for making a ludicrous statement that is acting like it's still 1948 or something, and the majority of the Jews in Israel are immigrants and not people who were born there. You talked about how Israel was allied with South Africa, which is true, but you don't refer to Israel's extensive connections with the African and emerging anti-colonial movements in Africa, particularly I believe with Kenya they had a very strong alliance. This was only broken in '67.
Let me just make sure. I appreciate your point. I just want to make sure that there's not, more than can be sort of responded to in a reasonable amount of time. So I don't know if you want to...
I have 3 more minutes.
Okay, sure, yeah.
South Africa, my understanding is decided with the UK during World War II. Is that not true? And you say that Israel's always active in U.S. interests. It's not until '63 that there's significant U.S. backing of Israel, which sort of actually attains the current levels around '67, where it becomes a primary partner. Your description of what happened in Nakba, I read Ben Morris's book, and it doesn't say what you said about the villages being destroyed. He goes through a long, or the second edition, he goes through a long thing trying to understand how the program of the expulsions actually came about, and he's changed his mind in different books, but it's obviously a very mixed bag about how it came about that the villages got emptied and then destroyed.
Those were
the things that I felt were missing in the narrative about the establishment of Israel.
Well, I think maybe I could group these. First of all, these are substantial and important questions. This is, I did have to compress the time frame, but my argument is not that British imperialism one-to-one relationship with Zionism. It's a whole, I don't even know how much to go here, but, early in his regime, Hitler actually explored the concept of deporting Jews to Madagascar as part of all, there were different ways that different imperialist countries, and I'm not equating the two, but there were different ways that different imperialist countries looked at the ways they might use a Zionist entity. There was a serious consideration at a World Zionist Conference of adopting a British-initiated proposal to locate a Jewish homeland in Uganda, and a less substantial consideration of doing it in what is today Belize, when that was expedient for British imperialism. The whole situation in the Middle East is very complex. British compradors were ruling Jordan, and British military officers did lead the Jordanian, intervention into Israel in 1948. But these things, what these things indicate is imperialist contention. There was a period during this whole time, the British had close ties with the Saudis, they had close ties with the Jordanians. It was, to say that it's not as simple as imperialist interests equal support of Israel. For example, today, the United States has very close ties with the Saudis, who are Islamic fundamentalists and anti-Semites. That's a fact. Does that mean then that the U.S. imperialism is not backing Israel? That's probably a less complex way to put it. The point isn't that Britain sponsored Jewish immigration from beginning to end. I think it probably, it's an arguably a fair argument that when they said a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism, they might not have meant a distinct country. But this is just to be blunt, nitpicking. This is the relativist, can't see the forest for the trees. Yes, there was contention. When Israel invaded Egypt during the Suez Canal War, the U.S. intervened on the side of Egypt against Israel, at least diplomatically, and pulled Israel's chain a bit. But that doesn't negate the overall role that Israel plays in the Middle East and profoundly today. Now, the argument that I think Richard was referencing, that we hear from many people, is that Israel is dictating to the U.S.
No, that's not my argument.
Oh, okay. I thought you were citing.
No, I completely disagree with that article.
All right, well, let's set that aside. As far as as far as pogroms in Poland, here again we have, you have to be able to distinguish principal aspects of something from secondary aspects. I saw a documentary about the Holocaust, and it described this incident where a few Jews had escaped, I think it was from Warsaw, and hooked up with Soviet-aligned Polish partisans who were fighting against the Nazis. Now, if they would have hooked up with Polish anti-Nazi partisans who were aligned with Britain, they probably would have been killed right away. As it turned out, they were integrated into this Soviet-led guerrilla unit, and the documentary made a big deal out of the fact that there was a lot of prejudice among Poles in that unit against Jews. Well, duh. I mean, this was to describe how global anti-Semitism was. And I will say, you know, we did get a criticism of this that we thought was valid, and we printed the criticism, and we're responding to it, that we somewhat oversimplified in this issue the causes of the Holocaust, intended to reduce them to the fact that the Soviet Union had a lot of support among Jewish people. But that was a big part of the picture, and there was a reason Jewish people of all political stripes and strata at the time. I mean, my rabidly Zionist father-in-law would always say, you know, the best friend we ever had was Stalin, coming from a, you know, a narrow Jewish nationalist perspective that he had. It was the case that, yeah, there was prejudice and pogroms in areas that the Soviet Union dominated, but this was, but overall what was going on, and especially in the early years of the Soviet Union, was educating people about the nature of anti-Semitism. So I think there was one, oh, the anti-colonial, okay.
Yeah, I don't know if there...
Just one sentence on the anti-colonial thing, because that was a major theme. You know, one of those anti-colonial leaders who Israel helped install, who you forgot to name, was Idi Amin, of course. And the point being that these anti-colonial, supporting anti-colonial movements in the interest of advancing the U.S. interests after World War II and bumping out the French and British who had dominated the Middle East and Africa was part of the way that the U.S. elbowed its way into colonial plunder and ripped off colonies from, you know, and established neo-colonial relationships with these oppressed nations, and Israel played a major role in that.
I just want to respond to the question about the pogroms in Poland after the war. From what I gather, actually, I don't think that that's something that could... The people who committed those pogroms against Jews were anti-communists, who were hostile to what they perceived as too much Jewish influence on the post-war Polish communist government. And in fact, one of the interesting things about Poland was that there was a mini renaissance of Jewish and Yiddish life among many of the survivors in Poland. It didn't last very long, but it did last for several years, and it was an interesting period. And the story of anti-Semitism in Poland post-war is a complicated and interesting story. But anyway, I agree with John, it doesn't actually have that much to do with the question of Zionism or Israel. And the foundation, I would also say something, people often talk about Israel being a response to the Holocaust. Israel is not really a response to the Holocaust. The Holocaust convinced many Jews to be Zionists. But the foundations, the material foundations of the State of Israel were already in place before the Holocaust. That's what enabled the State of Israel to come into existence. The fact that there were Holocaust survivors was added demographic material. The fact that there were later the Mizrahi Jews expelled, persecuted from Arab countries as a kind of retaliatory Arab chauvinism against Zionist expulsion. All of that contributed and strengthened Israel. The Zionists did not anticipate the Holocaust. They anticipated an intensification of ordinary anti-Semitism. In that respect, although it's often claimed that the Zionists took too pessimistic a view of anti-Semitism, you could argue they took an insufficiently pessimistic view of anti-Semitism. But I want to bring back the question also to 1848 and the whole role of nationalism.
You mean 1948?
No, 1848.
Oh, okay.
And about the problem of nationalism in several respects. One is that the whole problem of anti-Semitism and racialized anti-Semitism is really a product of the late 19th century. You have to distinguish between the suffering Jews experience, and Jews, you know, there's this famous book by Abraham Leon, famous in small radical circles, but Abraham Leon about the Jewish question, which he talks about the Jews as a people class. So the Jews had a people class character throughout, at least European Jews. Non-European Jews is another story, had a people class character throughout much of the Middle Ages. Modernity broke down that people class category as Jews were integrated into a capitalist economy. The history of modern anti-Semitism, therefore, is the specific history of the demonization of the Jews as a racial category. And also, unlike other forms of racial prejudice, it's connected to a populist anti-capitalism, because the stereotype of the Jew is largely the Jew as the representative of capital, or the abstract feature of capital. So the Jew could be both the representative of capital and of socialism. And that's a very different character from that of the prejudice against, say, blacks. People don't imagine blacks people dominating the economy. People imagine Jews as dominating the economy. So there's this famous phrase then of August Bebel, a famous leader of the German Socialist Party, that anti-Semitism was the socialism of fools. Also, even deeper, going deeper into the history of the problem of Jews and Marxism, is the fact that Marxism inherited essentially a liberal assumption about the nature of the Jewish question. In 1790, a liberal count, Clermont-Tonnerre, spoke in the French Assembly, the Revolutionary French Assembly, and he made a very famous phrase. He said that we should give to the Jews as a nation nothing, but as individuals everything. So part of the character of the development of modernity and the Jews, and modernity I mean capitalism, was the breaking down of the national religious character of the Jews. And this led to a multifarious character of the Jews, so that in Western Europe, particularly from the period, say, of the 1790s through the 1860s, the dominant trend of Jewish life was the liberal assimilationist paradigm. The paradigm that Herzl accepted before the rise of anti-Semitism. In Eastern Europe, something more complicated happened, to which I don't think sufficient recognition has been given in the dominant Marxist narrative, which is that Jews, many of whom spoke a different language from the people around them, developed a secular national identity, which was different from their previous religious national identity. And one result of that secular national identity was Zionism, but there were actually two Jewish nationalisms. There was also a Yiddish, mostly, not exclusively, socialist Yiddish nationalism, which sought a kind of national autonomy for Jews in the country that they lived in. Now, there are many reasons why that, again, didn't pan out.
Richard, let me see.
But I want to say that there is behind this also a complicated question about how the nature of Jewish difference is perceived, and the idea of Jews as a nation or just as a religious group. And you've seen, for example, in the Palestinian interpretation of a one-state solution, it used to be people would always speak about, for example, a secular democratic state. Now the rhetoric tends to be a binational state, which is a belated recognition that, for example, Israeli Jews constitute a national group.
So let me just see really quickly if there are any other questions, and if not, if you guys have any closing remarks.
Differences.
Or
arguments.
Opinions of some kind.
Oh,
It doesn't seem like they're quite
come on, ask questions.
proud here.
Well, I feel like the whole point of walking in here was sort of, because maybe this is too much to ask for, is to feel like what should be the appropriate way of even thinking about the Israel-Palestinian conflict today, with all this history, with all the 18th and 19th century foundations of the image of the Jew, with the foundation of the Israeli state. Of course, there's a conflict with nationalism and the character of how do we understand the overcoming of capitalism. But I think that I've heard some Richard once say that, the Israel-Palestinian conflict is not going to be resolved until there's a global revolution. It is really the only way we can.
I didn't say that. Chris said that.
No, I have an audio recording of you saying this.
I mean, it might be the case, but again, it depends on what you mean by a resolution. I mean,
a major argument.
What else I suppose, what I explained is that this is a problem that I usually don't want to touch with a sense of control. And the question is how, with all of this, to just not take one side or the other, we can understand the conflict.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a question of taking one side or another, because I think there are many sides. I think that it's wrong to understand it as just Israelis versus Palestinians. I think the problem is formulating a radical response Because even the people who are best, those Palestinians, Israelis who believe in genuine equality and coexistence, the formulation in which they understand that is not actually a radical context. It's essentially a liberal context, and you can say that that's very understandable given the circumstances under which they operate. So part of the problem is that I'm trying to formulate what I think would be a politics that really can't exist because there aren't the people on the ground to formulate social politics. I think realistically, if you look at the next few years, probably things will get worse. And if things get better, what you will have is some sort of two-state solution that is not great, but would be an improvement. I mean, that...
Yeah, no, I guess
I would just say...
I just understand it's getting better on the ground.
I mean, just in terms of how do you understand things and not take sides, Bill Maher, one not usually a huge fan of, did have a valid point criticizing Jon Stewart's non-rally when he said, if you are for sanity, wouldn't it make sense for you to take the side of people who are for sanity and are sane and oppose people who are insane? And then he went on to make other valid points about the Glenn Beck's rally and Jon Stewart's argument that, for example, well, don't call them racists and homophobes. Well, when a governor for New York says, that it's harmful to children to be exposed to a gay pride parade and it'll make their lives miserable, it's objectively a fact. He has and is promoting an irrational hatred and fear of gay people, and it is not taking sides in some subjective way. It's both understanding reality and taking sides to say that's homophobic and your movement is homophobic. So it's not, we really have to break out of, and I will really argue that, there is some convergence. We're back to the morality question here, You see a woman getting raped. Well, gee, he's raping her and she's screaming and scratching him. How do I understand this without taking sides? If you understand it, you will take sides. And that's why it's so important. That's why some of this history is not just, ancient history. I mean, I went to see Adam Shapiro's documentary on the, Palestinians in the diaspora living in refugee camps all around the Middle East and beyond. These events are not ancient history to them. They're today's reality.
That the only appropriate position to take is one of the most, those who have suffered the most. Somehow. And then the point is to justify to see which side suffered the most.
No, that's not what I'm arguing. There's a distinction between people who have suffered the most and people who are being oppressed and exploited and people who are oppressing and exploiting them. For example, if we look at U.S. society, there periodically in the history of this country there have been racist populist movements that have had the allegiance of desperately poor white people in the South. And they have vented their anger at the Hollywood liberals. Well, the Hollywood liberals are more on the side of justice and the interests of humanity than those particular very oppressed white people in this particular case. So it's not a question where you can determine, it's not, well, the Palestinians are living in refugee camps and the Israelis live in, the lifestyle of a middle-class American, many with swimming pools and golf courses and things like that. No, that's not enough to determine who's right and who's wrong. But we can scientifically look at, I appreciate it. Those were thoughtful arguments. That's my argument that Israel is not legitimate. I don't agree with them, and I think it's valuable to deconstruct it. But through this process, we can actually understand the nature of Israel, and then, yes, it does come down to morality and, confronting the fact that, look, I haven't heard anyone address this except, to his credit, the guy in the corner. There is a correspondence between not really wanting to go there in terms of getting to the bottom of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the lifestyle we enjoy as Americans that is built on what that conflict represents in essence, which is imperialist domination of this planet.
Well, we assume that in America we're not, to assume that there's a distinction of the national government and capitalism. We talk about capitalism, well, there's capitalism, and the system and to assume that there is a difference in oppression, in levels of oppression or something. I would say that under capital there is an equal kind of oppression in the United States. There is an Israel state in Palestine.
No. Okay, first of all, I am not arguing that Israel does not oppress Palestinians. I'm not arguing about which is the oppressor nation and which is the oppressed. The question is how you understand that fact of an oppressed nation and an oppressor nation, how you understand it politically, which I think is what the real difference is. It's true that many Israelis live a lifestyle that could be Southern California with Hebrew sun, but there are many Israelis who don't, just as there are many people in Southern California and New York City, working class people, who don't live that middle class lifestyle. I don't think scientifically that the US lifestyle or the Israeli or the Western European or the Japanese is actually built on the fact of imperialist oppression. That is that the majority of the population in those countries materially benefits from it. I don't think that it can be that it's actually the case that the majority of Israeli Jews materially benefit from the oppression of Palestinians. I think that's just wrong. You could argue that's an empirical question. We could have an argument about that. I think that way of understanding it. You also have, a lot of Israeli Jews are preoccupied with many other political questions other than the conflict. So you have the same type of class conflict that you have in other advanced capitalist societies. I read a very interesting article on a French anarchist website about the movement against Nechalev, which is the Israeli version of workfare. Basic sort of economic, poor people, whatever. And it's not highly politicized, just as these sort of things don't become highly politicized. But I don't think that you can just say that, for example, the people living in Sderot are economically privileged. They're better off than people in Gaza, but they're not benefiting from the oppression of people in Gaza. And they suffer a lot more than people in Tel Aviv, the really elite in Israel, who are out of range of the rockets of Hamas.
I wanted to just pick up on what you said and try to combine it with the question of morality, because I think you're both wrong in saying in Marxist theory there is such a thing as morality. There isn't. Marx is saying that the capitalist system is functioning in a really logic and necessary order in terms of the worker and the how do you say what's the opposite? Like the capitalist, exactly. They both play certain rules within the capitalist system, and they're not doing so because what you say, if you really believe that the capitalist system can be criticized morally, you automatically blame people for for what I would call it's a necessity within a capitalist system to actually exercise a capitalist ideology. I'm not saying that it's not to be criticized or that you don't have a choice within this framework, but I think it's necessary to understand that it's, like you said, a totalitarian system which forces people to act and to behave like that, or to play a certain rule, whether it's a capitalist or a worker. So, and I think if you're focusing on this moral issue, you automatically you're leading towards, and what I think is also wrong, interpreting the political situation in the world in terms of imperialist and anti-imperialist. Because if you perceive the world as a capitalist totality, you don't have to make this distinction between a country or a corporation being imperialist, because they're playing their role. I mean, it's not. I'm not saying that it's. I don't want to justify it, but I think it's this moral question. It's missing the point. I don't know if I could make myself.
So they're both subject to the function of capital, basically.
Yes, I agree with that. But I mean, first of all, strange, but I'm really agreeing with. I mean, I do think that people become Marxists not because of their understanding of capital, but because they want to live in a better world. And that the understanding of capitalism is something that is tied into that. But also that when you talk about the totality of capital, I mean, again, that also functions to some extent, I think, as an abstraction, getting away from the specific. I mean, I don't think that the totality of capital or the total logic of capital explains, for example, what goes on in Hebron. I don't think that it explains the shift in Palestinian politics from sort of secular nationalist in the 70s to Islamist in the rise of Hamas. I think that there are many ideological factors that can operate within the totality of capital. And I think the fact is, and it's a central assumption of Marxism, that capitalism generates opposition to it. I mean, unfortunately, the opposition has not been sufficiently strong. But, I mean, presumably people in this room are not totalitarian robots just programmed into capitalist ways of thinking. We have some kind of critical understanding of capitalism. Now, if capital were this totalitarian category, I don't see how you could understand it that way. I mean, yeah.
Well, it's interesting that we ended up on the question of morality. And it is, and I understand, okay, we're wrestling with Marxism. It is a basic point of Marxism that the economic foundation of society, the functioning of capital, defines the societal morality. People don't act the way they do out on the sidewalk, bump into you and get out of my way, or cut each other off in traffic because they're inherently assholes, or because Eve ate an apple, in the Garden of Eden. There is a society we live in that perpetuates a dog-eat-dog outlook, which is an expression of economic relations. But even, you go back to the Communist Manifesto, Marx talks a lot about morality, and when Marx and Engels talked about religion, they talked about religion being the soul of a soulless world, and, and even in in a lot of their writings, they talk about the reflection of economic relations and how people look at themselves and their relationships with others and morality. Now, Bob Avakian's new synthesis has identified that it's been, that dimension of things hasn't been appreciated enough. It seems like I've been arguing all night for let's boil things down to the basics and get to the bottom of things in terms of the Israel-Palestine conflict. But there are, the world is complex. Ideas, morals, they're not a mechanical reflection of reality. And there is an important moral struggle going on in America today. It takes the form of, maybe we're on the verge of like a major war in the Middle East if Israeli jets go attack this Iranian nuclear thing, and then Iran's proxies in Gaza and Lebanon, and yes, those forces are in large part proxies of Iran, retaliate against Israel, but look, there is, I find it rather incredible that in a room full of radicals, we don't have some common perception that the reason we're walking around with these has something to do with the wave of suicides in Chinese plants that make iPhones. You've read about the conditions, and yes, there are classes within the U.S. and very sharp class struggle. There are divisions between women and men in America, and those are very intense. There are divisions between oppressed nationalities and white people in America, very intense. But there is also a world where a handful of imperialist countries sit atop that world, and people are, when you read about civil wars in the Congo and war crimes in Rwanda, that's because the mineral that's essential for your cell phone is found in rivers in those countries. And your cell phone costs $99 with a 2-year contract because people are killing each other in Rwanda and the Congo over that. Morality and economics. You can be a rich person in America and say, I refuse to accept a world like that. It's not like, I'm rich, my interests lie in maintaining. No, the interests of humanity, which impact on you, don't argue for maintaining that horrific setup in the world. And I think, this, it gets back to the story I started out with when we were at Columbia. People said, Iran, maybe one nuclear weapon. Israel, okay, 200. No one knows. I mean, they haven't publicly released, but they have a major functioning nuclear arsenal which might be deployed against Iran. But which of those two threatens your way of life? The Israeli nuclear arsenal, and does that mean I'm arguing that that way of life is in your interest? Not at all. It's not in the interest of humanity. But there is a need to break out of looking at the world like Americans. And I'll just add one short anecdote. This is, apparently this was attributed to George Orwell. Maybe one of you knows the quote more accurately than I do. But he said something along the lines of, and he was an oppositional guy who had a critique of society, but apparently, if I remember right, he said something along the lines of, if it weren't for our colonies, England would just be a dreary, rady place where we'd all be. Does anybody remember this quote? Anyway, it was, England would just be another dreary little island, as opposed to the center of culture and economics and everything that it was. Orwell, went the wrong way on that. Some people looked at that and said that kind of world is intolerable. And this is what the question of Israel does boil down to.
So I know Alex, does anyone else have anything? And then we can tie it to maybe closing remarks. Alex, you can go ahead.
I guess my question is on the question of morality. And I think the problem with the way we're framing morality and Marxism is, I don't think Marxism is about the morality of who's the most oppressed. It's about the morality of what's human potential. And I think the argument's been revolving around the wrong definition of morality. I don't think telling the history of how the Jews oppressed the Palestinians and then how the Jews were oppressed by other people gets us anywhere. I mean, that's been going on forever. Like what gives?
Does anyone else have any?
I just think it's important to make a distinction between the morality that drives all of us to be interested in something like Marxism. It's important to make a distinction between that and the solution, which Marx talks about the reorganization of labor itself and freedom from necessity. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with morality as part of any kind of solution.
Is there anything else in particular? And then if we can, tie this as specifically to Israel as possible, the Israel-Palestine question as possible, and even reflecting back on the questions of that were issued to the panelists about what specific, if there's a way we can tie this to what specific Marxist point of view, or what the real sort of fundamental Marxist point of view is on this issue, that would be perfect, so we can do closing remarks and answer these questions.
Well, I think one of the things that this has shown about the question of a specific Marxist point of view on Israel-Palestine is how easily the discussion just gets formulated into terms that really have nothing to do with Marxism, perhaps. In terms of the question of morality, I guess I basically agree with the question that who is the most oppressed is not the question that's uppermost in my mind. It's the question of what a solution would be. So, yes, Palestinians are the oppressed nationality and the Israelis are the oppressor nationality. Also, in terms of the question of morality, it's also the question of how one conceives of political strategy. I remember a conversation I had with, he was actually a minister, a Christian minister, and he was pushing for the Presbyterian Church's divestment. And I had a conversation in which I argued, basically, you divest from a company that does X, and this has no effect in the world, because the logic of capitalism is obviously that if you sell your stock in a company because you think X company, and this is the general problem of moral investment, it has no effect on the behavior of that company as long as that company is profitable. And he said, oh yes, Noam Chomsky made that same argument, but I don't care because for me it's a moral question. So it's sort of, for me, the question is how do I behave morally in the world? So I guess I'm not so interested in the question of behaving morally, I'm interested in the question of the possibilities for human liberation, specifically Israelis and Palestinians, but more generally human beings in general, because you can't really separate these 10 or 20 million people who are Jews and Palestinians from everybody else on the planet. Specifically, concretely, the situation in Israel-Palestine is miserable. It's getting worse. It's not heading towards an immediate catastrophe. There's a lot of hysteria. But it could very well down the road lead to catastrophe, regional nuclear war, all sorts of things. Probably in the immediate future, the best thing one can hope for is a two-state solution. Because I see nobody advocating a one-state solution who seems to me serious about it in either a liberal or revolutionary policy. There really isn't any revolutionary Marxist politics in Israel-Palestine. There are a handful of intellectuals where they're everywhere. So basically the formulation of the politics is within a liberal context. I don't think that the liberal context and the way it's formulated around the one-state solution will triumph. If, for example, a one-state solution were to be taken seriously, you would have to do something like what Michael Tarazi said. You'd have to call, the Palestinians would have to stop calling for an independent state, they'd have to stop calling for an end to the occupation, and they'd have to say to the Israelis, annex us, give us full citizenship rights, and try to transform the state of Israel into a binational state. I see no desire seriously among Palestinians to try that. There are a lot of problems with that specifically. So the dominant political logic behind all of this mess is still a two-state solution, and the dominant obstacle to that, although there are other obstacles, not the only obstacle, is the U.S. and Israel. But again, the U.S. and Israel do not control everything in the region. They're autonomous logics, and they could run out of the control of the U.S. and Israel, and that would be very bad.
Well, it seems like an emerging question is there's all kinds of views on what does it mean to be a Marxist. Mao said Marxism consists of 1,000 truths, but they all boil down to one. It's right to rebel against reactionaries. Now that wasn't just Mao's take on Marxism, that was actually a scientific summation of what Marxism is about. He didn't discount the 1,000 truths. But if you don't want to rebel against reactionaries, sorry if I'm verging into morality here, you're not a Marxist. Mao also said that, if you're not a poet, it's dangerous to be a Marxist. So that's another dimension to this that I think goes against this kind of, I feel in the room, a bit of what Marx came about at a time when, and Richard said some interesting things about the emergence of capital, and it, the peasants got driven off the land. That was not a pretty picture, by the way. That was a very bloody process. And into the sweatshops and the things you've read about in Dickens. And a class arose that represented historically the potential for humanity to get beyond class society. Now, our critique, Bob Avakian's critique of Marx, is that Marx saw that a bit too mechanically in terms of, and that Marxists have somewhat too mechanically equated proletarians with the historic mission of the proletariat as a class. But from that perspective, if it all boils down to its right to rebel against oppression, then you do have, or against reactionaries, then you do, it's not ancient history and it's not counterproductive to try and understand the nature that Israel, and role that Israel plays in the world today. And in fact, I've said it, you've argued against it, but I have to come back to it. To not confront that, especially for people who live high on the imperialist food chain, it's not a personal insult. I live here too. But it's a question of understanding why people in this country have a different inclination to get to the bottom of the Palestinian situation than people in the Middle East do. It's not because, Arabs have always hated Jews. People are in a different position vis-a-vis this imperialist food chain. And in that context, it's intriguing and heartening to me to be in a room with people who are trying to wrestle with what is Marxism and how to apply it. But I think if you, first of all, we can't start from what is Marxism, how to apply it. We have to start from what's real and what's true. And hey, if Marxism turns out not to be true, then or have its limitations, then so be it. And that's, that's reality. But Marxism does concentrate a lot of truths. It is the most concentrated method and approach for understanding and changing the world, correctly understood. And in that light, I will just make first of all, I do want to note that in addition to this special issue on Israel, which I do have here tonight, we are serializing a very substantial response to the criticism I referred to earlier from a reader that we had portrayed the causes of the Holocaust somewhat too narrowly, and Richard did introduce some of the whole, the historic, he didn't emphasize it that much, but there, for over 1,000 years, Jews were the Christ killers in Europe and subject to pogroms, and understanding that and then how that changed under capitalism, the role of the Holocaust and how that all fits into the picture is really important, both in its own right and because that, to me, in my experience struggling around the nature of Israel with people, that's the bottom line argument of many people. The only way Jews are really going to keep from, I'm growing up Jewish, I've heard this, over and over again in very personal terms. Whatever they say in our cases, the Goyim have always hated us, always will, and if we don't have our own country, they'll kill us. Well, we have a substantial response to breaking out of that whole framework that is in this issue.
Yeah, did you have a... I know this was sort of final remarks, but I know if there is if the panelists have...
Or we can stick around informally if people are more comfortable.
I would be actually really interested in, when you're talking so much about oppression towards the Israelis, what the Israelis do to the Palestinians. You even made a whole newspaper out of it, obviously. I would be really interested what are you actually thinking about the oppression in other countries in the world, but also in the Arab world, about oppression of women in Saudi Arabia, or about the oppression of the resistance movement in Iran, for example. And don't you think that these regimes are producing a much worse oppression than Israel is doing?
Well, the short answer is I do support the resistance in Iran. I mean, when I was on the Gaza Freedom March, there was a lot of, sharp struggle among people on the Gaza Freedom March, and I was, building support for the struggle in Iran, and in particular for radical secular and communist forces within that opposition to the Islamic Republic of Iran. One of the first things that Khomeini did when he took power was to kill all the communists, and yeah. But, yes, we support liberation struggles in all these countries. But in terms of its role in the global network of imperialism, that defines the world we live in, and I'm finding a little, not wanting to go there in the room, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the particularity. Look, let me put it this way. If Bosnia had succeeded in it, if Serbia had succeeded in its aims during the civil war in Yugoslavia, conquered all of former Yugoslavia without the intervention of the US and Germany and so on, pushed all the Bosnians out, no, Bosnia would not be the biggest oppressor in the world. Yes, there would be other, I'm sorry, I keep mixing them up. Serbia would not be the biggest oppressor in the world. It would not be, the only oppressor in the world, but a greater Serbia, had one been established by pushing out all the oppressed nationalities in the former Yugoslavia, would not be a legitimate country. That is just an objective fact. Israel was established on the basis of ethnic cleansing.
What do you consider a legitimate country? I think this category of legitimate country is a bit bizarre. Every nation state in the world is just an organized force. The question of whether a country is legitimate or not has really little to do with any reality. Almost every state in the Western Hemisphere is the product of settler colonialism. I mean, when I actually spoke at a panel a few years ago. It was a very bizarre panel because I was paired with an ultra-Orthodox Jew from the Neturei Karta, and we were invited by the Arab student group, and we were supposed to represent diverse Jewish views on Israel. And so half the room was like Arab and sympathetic, and half the room were kind of right-wing Zionist. And they've totally focused on this ultra-Orthodox Jew as this representative of anti-Zionism, which is very bizarre, and they didn't pay any attention to me. But one of the questions that I remember, and it was asked by actually an Indian Jew, who later I found out turns out to be fluent in Yiddish, was, well, what would you say about the Hawaiians? Like, what would you say about the native Hawaiians? And I would say, well, you know, the conquest and colonization of Hawaii was obviously a great misfortune for the Hawaiians, but nothing really can be done about it. Now, in that respect, the Palestinians are better off than the Hawaiians or the American Indians or most of the victims of settler colonialism, because they still largely are in Palestine. I mean, historic Palestine is almost 50%. I don't know what the exact figure is, but it's like 48% or something Palestinian, the totality, not Green Line Israel. So the Palestinians are still there. And I don't think that Israeli right-wing plans to expel that there's going to be a mass expulsion. So I don't think that either nationality is going anywhere soon. And in that respect, the Palestinians are better off. But I don't think that talking about the legitimacy, what is the legitimacy of the United States? The legitimacy of the United States is that it exists. That it's the accumulation of the most immense force on the planet. And the problem is not to talk about the legitimacy of a nation state, which only reinforces a conservative view of the world order, but to ask, how can one abolish the world system? Because it's a worldwide problem. In other words, we shouldn't be thinking about sort of the specificity of the American role, but rather the totality and the way that a successful socialist revolution in the United States would radically transform the entire world political spectrum.
But wouldn't that mean to actually deny the theory or the necessity on pounding on imperialism? Because if you say, okay, you said it like a couple of times, pulling your mobile phone and saying, hey, 4 or 5 countries are ruling this war. So what if there are no 4 or 5 countries? Then is it any better to work in a capitalist country without being like an imperialist?
No, but I think the two positions are opposed. I mean, if you are really talking about the way the world is set up, I mean, there is the history of imperialism. There is the specific history of capitalism and its organization in nation states, and the fact that some nation states have played an unequal role in terms of the development of capital. So capital has not equally developed all over the planet in the same way. However, if you're talking about, say, a revolution that occurred in the United States or Western Europe, that would, in effect, I would argue, abolish the world capitalist system. And the one consequence of that would be the abolition of the nation state. Now, the same does not apply to the possibility for a socialist revolution in some weak third world country. I mean, I think you're posing two false oppositions. One, that there's either a total global totality of capitalism as against the theory of imperialism, versus John's claim that our standard of living in the U.S. is directly dependent upon the exploitation of third world countries, a claim that I would reject.
Richard, let me leave it at that, and then, well, let's first of all, we'll thank our panel. Thank you guys very much for and just 3 really quick things. This Saturday, the Platypus Affiliated Society will be hosting an all-day event on art criticism and art critique, which will be at the New School University. If anyone's interested, you can go on our website here and register. We just ask that you register because we only have a limited number of spots available. And then secondly, we have weekly events that we do, like coffee breaks and a reading group. So, yeah.
There's just one thing I want to mention, because John mentioned the the new synthesis of the RCP. There was actually an article in a recent issue of Platypus devoted to reviewing that. So people might be interested in reading the new synthesis and reading that article.
And there are some reviews over here as well. And specifically, issue 28 has the discussion on Israel and communism that Richard had mentioned earlier. And then finally, I have a sign-up sheet if anyone's interested to get email listings from the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'll grab it now, pass it around. Otherwise, you can stick around for more informal discussion. And thank you, panelists, again.
Yes, for everybody else. One of you were